The first gray light of morning found Maggie Langley on her knees in the canyon dust, pressing her palm hard against a stranger's bleeding shoulder while he stared up at her with eyes that did not yet know if they belonged to the living or the dead. She had come down to the bridge site early, before the heat rose off the rock and before her crew arrived, to check the new truss joints she had cut the night before by lantern light. Instead, she had found him lying half in the wagon ruts at the canyon rim, his shirt soaked black, one boot missing, his horse nowhere in sight. She had not screamed. She had learned long ago that screaming did not put nails in boards or blood back in a man. So instead she had torn a strip from her own petticoat and pressed it to the wound, and shouted for help toward the timber camp until her voice cracked. That was how Abraham Chandler found her, kneeling in the red dirt with her sleeves rolled and her hands red to the wrist. A woman who did not look up when he swung down from his horse because she did not have a hand free to spare for looking. "He is alive," she said before he could ask. "Barely. Somebody shot him twice, once clean through and once that stayed in him." Abraham Chandler crouched beside her without a word of greeting, because there was no room yet for names or manners, and pressed 2 fingers to the man's throat. His badge caught the early sun, a small dull star pinned crooked to a leather vest that had clearly been mended more than once by a careful hand, though not so careful as Maggie's own. "Marshal Chandler," he said finally, as if she had asked, though she had not. "We will need to get him to Doc Whitlock. Can you hold him steady while I lift?" "I have been holding him steady for the better part of an hour, Marshal. I expect I can manage a little longer." He almost smiled at that. She would think later, though at the time she had been too frightened and too angry at the general unfairness of finding a dying stranger before breakfast to notice much beyond the width of his shoulders and the sureness of his hands as he gathered the wounded man up like he weighed nothing at all. They rode together into Pedra Crossing with the stranger slung across Abraham's saddle and Maggie walking her own horse close behind, one hand still resting on the man's good shoulder to keep him from sliding. And it was in this manner, dusty and bloodied and entirely unglamorous, that Maggie Langley and Abraham Chandler began whatever it was they were going to become to each other. Doc Whitlock's front room smelled of carbolic and coffee, and it was there, an hour later, with the bullet dug out and the bleeding stopped and half the town's curiosity gathered outside the window, that the stranger's eyes came open all the way for the first time. He looked wild, feverish, his gaze skating over the ceiling beams before it caught on Abraham's badge and fixed there like a man grabbing a rope. "Langley," he rasped. "It was Langley. Langley done it, shot me over the split, left me for the buzzards. Langley, I swear it." Maggie felt the word land in her chest like a dropped hammer. "That is my family's name," she said, too quickly, before she could think better of announcing it in a room full of strangers. "There is some mistake. My brother Daniel would never." But Abraham Chandler was already moving, already reaching for his hat, his face gone hard and closed in the particular way of a lawman who has just been handed a name and a task, and does not yet know enough to doubt either. "Ma'am, I am sorry," he said, and he did sound sorry. She would give him that much even in her fury later. "But I have a wounded man naming your brother as the one who shot him, and I have had reports of a silver shipment gone missing from the Cochise Road not 3 nights past. I cannot ignore that." "You can ask questions before you ignore a man's whole life," Maggie snapped, already following him out the door and into the white glare of noon. "You can find out where he was before you drag him through town in irons." "I intend to ask questions," Abraham said, not slowing his stride toward the lumber yard where Daniel worked. "I intend to ask them of your brother, directly, starting now." She had never in her life wanted so badly to plant her boot in the seat of a man's trousers. Daniel Langley was up on the half-finished span when they arrived, straddling a crossbeam 40 feet above the canyon floor with a mouth full of nails and a level in his hand, entirely unaware that his morning was about to end in handcuffs. Maggie watched, helpless, sick with a fear that tasted like copper, as Abraham Chandler called him down, informed him in a level, almost gentle voice that he was wanted for questioning in a shooting and a robbery, and clicked iron cuffs around wrists that had done nothing all night but saw pine and sweat under lantern light beside his sister. "He was with me," Maggie said, planting herself in front of the marshal's horse before he could mount up with her brother walking beside him. "All night, Marshal Chandler. We were cutting the North Truss together until near 2 in the morning. Ask the night watchman, ask anybody on that crew, ask the moon itself if you have to, but you will not find 1 hour where my brother was anywhere but 40 feet of scaffolding away from wherever that man got shot." "I will ask all of them," Abraham said. "That is exactly what I intend to do. But I have a dying man's testimony and a name, and until I have something to weigh against it, your brother sits in my jail. That is the law, Miss Langley, not my pleasure." "Then you had better weigh fast, Marshal," Maggie said, low and shaking, "because I promise you, if you have ruined my brother's name on the word of a half-dead stranger who could have meant any Langley in this territory or none at all, I will make you answer for every hour of it." He looked at her then, really looked, and something crossed his face that was not quite guilt and not quite admiration but some uneasy cousin of both. "I expect you will," he said quietly, and turned his horse toward the jail. The town of Pedra Crossing had grown up on the lip of a canyon too deep and too wide to bridge in any easy fashion, and for 11 years the only way across it, for cattle or wagons or the silver that came down from the Whitlock Hills, had been Cornelius Pratt's ferry, a great flat barge on cables that Pratt's father had strung across the gorge back when the territory was younger and less patient. Pratt had inherited the ferry and the tolls that came with it, and he had grown fat and comfortable on both, until the Territorial Council had decided that a canyon settlement sitting astride the main freight road to the mining camps could no longer afford to depend on one barge and one rich man's mood. They had hired Maggie Langley to build them a bridge. She had come west from Ohio 3 years before with her brother and her father's tools, after her father died and left her the only carpenter in the family and precious little else, and she had spent those 3 years proving, contract by contract, barn by barn, church roof by church roof, that a woman could set a joint as true as any man in the territory. The bridge contract was the largest of her life, the one that would either make her name from Tucson to Prescott or break it entirely, and she had known from the first survey stake that Cornelius Pratt would rather see the canyon swallow the whole project than watch his ferry tolls dry up. She had not expected him to try to swallow her brother instead. "You cannot hold a man on the ravings of a gutshot stranger," Maggie said, 3 days later, standing in the council chamber with sawdust still in the creases of her knuckles, because she had come straight from the site rather than lose an hour arguing when she might spend it working. "Daniel had nothing to do with any robbery. I can produce 6 men who will swear he was on that scaffold all night." Cornelius Pratt sat at the head of the council table with his hands folded over his considerable stomach, looking for all the world like a man deeply saddened by circumstances entirely outside his control. "Miss Langley," he said, in the syrupy tone he used when he wanted an audience to think him reasonable, "no one doubts your devotion to your brother, but the council did agree when we hired you that the contractor's household ought to be of good repute, given the public funds involved. A brother accused of robbery and attempted murder does raise questions. He has not been convicted of anything. He has not even been charged, has he, Marshal?" Maggie turned on Abraham Chandler, who stood near the window with his hat in his hands, looking like a man wishing very much to be somewhere else. "Or have you found your evidence already?" "No charges yet," Abraham admitted. "I am still investigating." "Then perhaps," Pratt said smoothly, "the council should consider suspending the bridge contract until the matter is resolved, in fairness to the town's investment." "In fairness to your ferry tolls, you mean," Maggie shot back, and the room went very still, and Judge Whitfield, who chaired the council and disliked Pratt only slightly less than he disliked delay, cleared his throat and said that the contract would stand for now, that the bridge was 2 months from the mine's summer silver run, and the town could not afford to lose the season, but that Marshal Chandler had 1 week to resolve the matter of the shooting to the council's satisfaction. 1 week. Maggie walked out of that chamber with her jaw set, and her mind already sorting the problem the way she sorted a bad plank, looking for the grain, the weak spot, the place where the whole thing might be persuaded to split clean if she found the right angle and struck it true. She found Abraham Chandler waiting for her on the boardwalk outside, hat back on now, looking apologetic in a way she was not yet inclined to forgive. "Miss Langley, Maggie," she said. "You have arrested my brother on a lie, Marshal Chandler, or a mistake, or something in between, and either way you are going to help me prove it before that man, and there costs me everything I have built in this territory. So you might as well use my given name, since we are going to be spending considerable time together whether either of us likes it." Something flickered in his dark eyes, surprise perhaps, or the ghost of amusement. "Abraham," he said, "and I do intend to help you, Maggie. I never wanted to arrest an innocent man, but I need to know more about that stranger before I can undo what I have done, and he has not woken clear-headed since that first morning." "Then let us go make him wake clear-headed," Maggie said, and set off toward the doctor's house without waiting to see if he followed, though of course he did, his long stride matching hers within a dozen paces, and she found she did not mind the sound of his boots beside hers half so much as she wanted to. The wounded man, whose name Doc Whitlock had gotten out of him as Jesse Odell, spent most of that week drifting between fever and a stubborn, frightened silence, and it was Maggie, not Abraham, who finally got anything useful from him, sitting at his bedside on the fourth evening with a bowl of broth and more patience than the marshal's badge seemed to inspire in the man. "You said Langley," she told him, spooning broth past his cracked lips. "But you never saw my brother before that morning in your life, did you, Mr. Odell?" He turned his face away, but she saw the flicker of something like shame cross it. "The boss said if it went bad," he mumbled at last, so quiet she had to lean close to catch it, "if it went bad and somebody caught me, I was to say Langley. Whichever Langley I could find. Said it would muddy the water good on account of the bridge and all." Maggie sat back slowly, the bowl forgotten in her lap, cold understanding pooling in her stomach like well water. "Whichever Langley. You mean you were told to use my family's name before you ever laid eyes on my brother? Someone sent you here already knowing what name to say?" Odell would not meet her eyes. "I have said too much already. He will kill me for what I already said." "Who will kill you? Who is your boss, Mr. Odell?" But he had gone rigid and silent, staring at the door as though the man in question might walk through it at any moment, and no amount of coaxing from Maggie or gentle pressing from Doc Whitlock could pry loose another word that night. Still, she rode back to the bridge site with something she had not had before, proof, however thin, that this was not a mistaken identity but a design, a name chosen ahead of time to do exactly the damage it had done. Someone had wanted a Langley blamed. Someone had known, before the shooting ever happened, that framing her family would strike at the bridge itself. She found Abraham at the jail, going over the manifest of the missing silver shipment by lamplight, and told him what she had learned. He went very still. "Whoever planned this knew about the bridge contract," he said slowly. "Knew it well enough to see the advantage in ruining your family's name at exactly this time. There is only one man in this territory who profits from my family's ruin," Maggie said. "Cornelius Pratt." "Pratt is greedy and he is cruel in his way," Abraham said. "But robbing a silver shipment and shooting his own hired man is a different animal than squeezing a council vote. I have known men like Pratt. They do not soil their hands. They pay other men to soil theirs." He rubbed the back of his neck, and for just a moment something haunted crossed his face, gone so quickly Maggie almost missed it. "I will need to find out who Pratt might have paid." "You sound like a man with an idea of where to look," Maggie said, watching him closely. "I have some old acquaintances in the territory," Abraham said, too carefully, and turned back to his ledger before she could ask him to explain what kind of acquaintance a marshal kept who might know the underside of a robbery scheme. And Maggie, though she noticed the evasion, let it lie for the moment, because she had a bridge to finish and a brother to free, and not yet enough trust in this quiet, careful man to press him on secrets she could only half sense. That trust, however reluctant, grew in the days that followed the way trust often does on a frontier, not through grand declarations, but through the accumulation of small, ordinary faithfulness. Abraham rode out to the canyon site twice that week, ostensibly to question the crew about the night of the shooting, but he stayed to help haul timber when a wagon axle broke, and he held the far end of a chalk line steady for an hour without complaint while Maggie snapped true marks across a stringer 20 feet long, and he did not once tell her that a woman had no business climbing scaffolding in a split skirt, though she watched him notice, more than once, and say nothing. Which she came to understand was its own kind of respect. "You set that joint like a man who has done this work his whole life," he told her one evening, watching her fit a mortise with 3 strokes of a chisel that most carpenters needed 6 for. "My father built barns and churches from Ohio to the Mississippi," Maggie said, not looking up from her work. "He had no sons old enough to help until Daniel came along, so he taught me instead, and by the time Daniel was old enough to hold a saw, I already loved the work too much to give it up. Most men in this territory think a woman ought to want a husband to build her a house, not a hammer to build it herself." "I think," Abraham said, with a seriousness that made her look up despite herself, "that a woman who builds her own house need never worry about what kind of man she marries, because she will already know she does not require rescuing." Maggie felt her face warm and busied herself with her chisel to hide it. "That is a very fine thing to say for a man who arrested my brother on a stranger's word." "I have not stopped being sorry for that," Abraham said quietly. "I do not intend to stop until it is put right." It was on the 6th night of that week, with the council's deadline breathing down her neck like a hot wind, that Maggie discovered the sabotage. She had gone back to the site after dark to check the North Truss one final time before the crew arrived at dawn, and she found the main cable anchor, the great iron ring that would eventually take the whole weight of the span, half sawn through where the rock met the bolt, hidden cleverly beneath a smear of fresh mud, so that no eye would catch it in daylight until the bridge bore its first real load, and the whole span came down into the gorge, likely with men still on it. She stood there a long while in the moonlight with her lantern shaking slightly in her hand, understanding fully for the first time how far someone was willing to go, and then she rode for the marshal's office faster than she had ridden anything in years. Abraham came out onto his porch in his shirt sleeves, gun already in hand at the sound of hooves at that hour, and when she told him what she had found, his face went the color of ash. "That is not sabotage meant to delay you," he said. "That is sabotage meant to kill whoever is standing on that span when it fails. Maggie, that could have been you. That could have been your whole crew." "I know," she said, and found, to her own surprise, that her voice cracked on the word, the fear she had held down riding back to town finally catching up to her now that she was standing somewhere safe. Abraham crossed the porch in 2 strides and caught her by the shoulders, steadying her the way he might steady a spooked horse, and for a moment neither of them said anything at all, the night full of crickets and the distant lowing of a cattle herd bedded down somewhere south of town, waiting for morning to push north toward the rail junction. "I am going to post a man at the site every night from now until it is finished," Abraham said finally, his hands still warm on her shoulders. "And I am going to find whoever did this, Maggie. I swear it to you." "You keep swearing things to me, Marshal," she said, some of her old sharpness returning now that the fright had passed. "I am beginning to wonder how many oaths a lawman is permitted to make before they start canceling each other out." He almost laughed, and the sound of it, low and surprised, did something warm and unfamiliar to the middle of her chest. But 2 days later, going through the jail's back room to retrieve Daniel's confiscated tool belt, which Abraham had promised to return, Maggie found something that made the warmth curdle into cold suspicion. Tucked beneath a stack of old wanted circulars in a desk drawer that had been left half open, was a single yellowed poster, edges soft with age, bearing a crude engraving of a much younger man's face beneath the words wanted for robbery and horse theft. And though the name printed beneath it read Abraham Chandler, the eyes staring out from that old paper were unmistakably the same eyes that had looked at her with such gentleness on the porch 2 nights before. Folded inside the poster, more damning still, was a note in a cramped, unfamiliar hand. "You know what I want, Chandler. One more ride and your old name stays buried where it belongs. Think on the gold crossing at the ferry. Think hard before I decide your secret is worth more spoken than kept." Maggie stood very still in that dusty back room with the paper trembling in her hand, feeling something inside her chest crack clean through. Not because a man might have a past. Every soul on this frontier carried some kind of past. But because he had let her stand on that porch and swear his oaths to her while carrying a threat like this folded in a drawer not 10 feet from where her brother sat in a cell. She was still standing there when Abraham came in. "Maggie." His voice had gone careful, wary, the voice of a man who has just realized a door he thought locked stood open. "That is not what you think." "Then tell me what it is," Maggie said, and her own voice came out steadier than she felt. "Tell me who Abraham Chandler is, and who wrote you this very charming note about gold at the ferry crossing, and then perhaps I will decide whether it is what I think or something worse." He was quiet for a long moment, long enough that she thought he might refuse her entirely, and that silence hurt worse than any lie could have. "I was 17 when my father died," Abraham said finally, low and rough, sitting heavily on the edge of the desk as though his legs had decided the conversation required less dignity than standing. "My mother is a Sonoran woman, from good ranching people, the Ibaras, and my father was an Anglo cattleman who married her against half the territory's wishes and loved her every day until a fever took him. After he died, the men who had wanted our ranch's water rights for years finally had their excuse to push us off it. I was young and angry, and I fell in with men who promised me a way to take back what had been stolen from my mother. We robbed a mine payroll in Sonora. Nobody died, but it was still a crime, and I rode with those men under the name Abraham Chandler for the better part of 2 years before I understood what kind of men they truly were and got out, and became, eventually, the man standing in front of you now." "And Chandler became Chandler," Maggie said quietly, "the marshal who arrests other men for exactly what he once did." "I have spent 12 years trying to be worth more than that mistake," Abraham said, and there was real pain in it, enough that some of her anger softened despite her best effort to hold it. "But one of the men I rode with then, a man named Silas Kane, never let go of what he knew about me. He turned up here in Pedra Crossing 3 weeks ago, before that shooting, before any of this. He has been threatening to tell the whole territory who Marshal Chandler used to be unless I help him with one more job." "The silver shipment," Maggie said, understanding arriving like a physical blow. "He wants you to look away while he robs it." "And when Jesse Odell got shot instead of playing his part clean, Kane had him blame my brother, because ruining the bridge project would keep this whole town too distracted and too broke to fund a real investigation into a missing shipment." "I believe so, yes," Abraham said heavily. "I have suspected Kane from nearly the first night, Maggie, but I did not know how to move against him without him making good on his threat, and I confess I was a coward about telling you, because I did not want you to look at me the way you are looking at me right now. How am I looking at you, Marshal Chandler? Like a woman who trusted a man and found out he let an innocent boy sit in a cell rather than risk his own secret." The accusation, spoken in his own voice before she could speak it in hers, took some of the wind from her fury, though not all of it. "You should have told me the first night," she said. "You let me argue with the council, let me sit at that man's bedside, let me believe you were simply slow and stubborn rather than afraid, when the whole time you knew who was really behind it." "I know," Abraham said. "I am telling you now. I am done being afraid of what Kane can take from me, Maggie, because I have already seen what staying silent has cost your family, and I will not let it cost anyone else." She studied him a long moment in the lamplight, this man with two names and one conscience, and found, somewhat against her own better judgment, that she believed him. "Then we had better find a way to catch Silas Kane," she said, "before he finishes what he started, and before my brother spends one more day paying for a crime that belongs entirely to other men." They laid their plan at the kitchen table in Maggie's small rented house on the edge of town, a table built, like most things Maggie owned, by her own hands, and it was there over cold coffee and a borrowed county map that Abraham told her everything he had pieced together about Kane's design. The mine's summer silver run, the largest shipment of the season, was due to come down from the Whitlock Hills by wagon within the week, transferred at the Benson Rail Depot to the westbound train, then carried onward by a second wagon crew across Pratt's Ferry to the smelter beyond the canyon, since the bridge remained unfinished. Kane meant to take it not at the mine, where guards were thick, nor at the ferry, where Pratt's own men watched too closely for a stranger's comfort, but somewhere in between, likely at the depot itself, in the crowded chaos of a rail platform thick with cattle drovers and freight handlers where one more armed man might pass unnoticed. "And Jesse Odell," Maggie said, tapping the map. "He said the boss told him what to say if things went wrong. That means Kane already expected trouble. Why would he expect trouble unless someone inside the operation was unreliable?" "Because Kane never trusted the men he hired," Abraham said. "He never has. I remember that much of him from before. He keeps loyalty through fear, not affection, and fear breaks under enough pressure. If we can get Jesse Odell well enough to testify openly, and get him somewhere safe enough that Kane cannot silence him first, we can bring the whole scheme into daylight before that train ever reaches Benson." "Then we had better move him soon," Maggie said, "because I do not believe for one moment that Kane does not already know we have been speaking with him." She was right to worry. 2 nights later, someone tried to burn Doc Whitlock's house down with Jesse Odell still inside it. Maggie was the one who smelled the smoke first, walking home late from the bridge site after a final round of lantern-lit measurements, and she screamed the alarm loud enough to wake half the street before running straight for the doctor's door herself, heedless of the flame already licking up the porch timbers. She got the door open before anyone else arrived, choking on smoke, and found Doc Whitlock already dragging Odell's cot toward the back window, the old doctor's hands shaking as badly as the wounded man's. Abraham arrived at a dead run moments later, and between the 3 of them and 2 neighbors with water buckets, they got the fire beaten back before it consumed more than the porch and one wall, and got Odell carried out into the street on his cot, coughing but alive, his eyes wide with a terror that had nothing to do with smoke. "He knows I talked," Odell wheezed, gripping Maggie's sleeve with surprising strength for a man who had nearly died twice in 1 month. "Kane knows. He will not stop till I am dead, ma'am, please. You got to keep me somewhere he cannot reach." "We will," Maggie said, and looked up to find Abraham already giving orders, moving Odell instead to the jail itself, the one building in town with iron bars and a marshal willing to sit up all night with a shotgun across his knees. It was Maggie's idea, in the end, to move him a second time before dawn, to her own bridge site, of all places, into the half-built toolshed at the canyon rim, where a stranger would have to cross open ground in full view of a dozen sleeping workmen to reach him. Abraham argued against it at first, calling it reckless, but Maggie pointed out, correctly, that Kane's men already knew every room in town that might hide a wounded witness, and the one place no one would think to look was the middle of a construction site guarded by carpenters who kept their axes close at hand out of habit rather than heroism. They sat up together that first night in the unfinished shed, Abraham with his shotgun and Maggie with a lantern turned low, Odell asleep at last on a bed of wood shavings, and it was in the long, quiet hours before dawn, with the canyon wind sighing through the half-raised trusses of her bridge, that Maggie Langley and Abraham Chandler finally said the things to each other that fear and pride had kept locked away all week. "I did not think, when I found you kneeling over a dying stranger a fortnight ago," Abraham said quietly, "that I would end up owing you my whole understanding of what courage looks like." "I did not think," Maggie said, "that I would end up trusting a lawman who arrested my brother on a lie. I never wanted to be the kind of man who let fear decide what was right," he said. "My mother raised me better than that, even if I forgot it for a while. She used to say a man who is afraid of his own shadow will eventually mistake every dark thing for his own reflection. That sounds like a wise woman. She is. You would like her. She still rides better than most vaqueros half her age, and she has never once let my father's dying stop her from running the rancho exactly as she pleases." He glanced at Maggie sideways in the lantern light. "I think she would like you a great deal, actually. She has no patience for women who wait to be told what they are capable of." "Then I suppose I shall have to meet her someday," Maggie said, and was surprised at how much she meant it, and more surprised still at the way Abraham's whole face changed at the words, softening into something unguarded that she had not seen from him before. "I would like that very much," he said, and reached across the narrow space between them to take her hand, not pulling her closer, only holding, as though asking permission for something larger than the gesture itself. "Abraham," Maggie said, and found she liked the shape of his name in her mouth more than she had expected to. "I am still angry with you, about the drawer and the silence, and letting my brother sit in that cell an hour longer than he needed to." "I know," he said. "I do not ask you to stop being angry. I only ask you to let me earn something better than anger if I can." "You may try," Maggie allowed, and let her fingers curl around his. And out on the canyon rim, the first gray edge of dawn began to climb over the far cliffs, indifferent to the fact that something quiet and important had just shifted between two people sitting watch over a frightened man in an unfinished shed. The silver shipment left the Whitlock mine 3 days later, exactly on the schedule Kane had been counting on, and Abraham and Maggie rode for Benson a full day ahead of it. Jesse Odell bundled into the back of a freight wagon between them with a blanket over his face and Doc Whitlock's own shotgun across Maggie's knees, because they had agreed, after much argument, that the safest place for the one witness who could name Silas Kane outright was directly beside the two people most determined to keep him breathing. Benson in June of 1883 was a town built entirely around the iron rails that had reached it 3 years before, a sprawl of adobe and clapboard strung along the Southern Pacific line, its single platform perpetually thick with the noise and dust of cattle being loaded for the eastern markets, freight wagons rumbling in from the mining camps, and drovers fresh off the trail spending their pay too fast in the saloons that lined the main street. It was, Abraham said grimly, exactly the kind of chaos a man like Kane would choose to hide inside, and exactly the kind of chaos that would make protecting one frightened witness considerably harder than it had been in the quiet of a canyon toolshed. They reached the depot at midday, the shipment expected on the westbound afternoon train, and found the platform already a sea of noise, lowing cattle in the loading pens beside the tracks, drovers shouting, a freight agent arguing with a rancher over manifest weights, and beneath all of it, Maggie felt certain, Silas Kane and whatever men he had bought with Pratt's money, watching from somewhere in the crowd for their chance. They did not have long to wait. The trouble began not with the silver, which arrived under heavy guard and was transferred with tedious, watchful efficiency, but with Jesse Odell himself, who had been installed, at Abraham's insistence, on a westbound passenger car under a deputy's guard, meant to be carried onward to Tucson, where a territorial judge could take his sworn statement, somewhere Kane's reach did not extend. It was as the boarding call went up, the platform crowded shoulder to shoulder with passengers and porters, and a dozen cowhands loading a last string of steers into a stock car, that Maggie spotted a man in a dust-colored coat, moving too purposefully through the crowd toward Odell's car, one hand resting inside his coat in a way that made her blood run suddenly cold. "Abraham," she said, and did not need to say more because he had already seen the same thing, already begun shoving through the crowd with a speed that startled a drover half out of his boots. What happened next happened fast, the way real danger always does, faster than either of them would be able to describe clearly afterward. The man in the dust-colored coat reached the car steps just as the deputy turned to hand up a satchel, and in that unguarded instant, he struck the deputy across the back of the skull with something hard and metal, snatched the satchel, which Maggie realized with a sick lurch contained not only Odell's signed statement, but the ledger of Pratt's payments to Kane that Doc Whitlock had helped them recover from the burned house, and bolted back into the crowd with the satchel clutched to his chest. "Stop him!" Maggie shouted, but the platform was too thick with startled bystanders, cattle bawling, someone's dropped crate of chickens scattering white feathers into the dust, and the thief was already cutting sideways through a gap between two freight wagons. Abraham did not shout. He simply moved, vaulting the low platform rail in one motion that Maggie would think of for years afterward as the moment she truly understood what it meant that this man had grown up in a saddle before he had grown up anywhere else, and swung himself onto the nearest horse, a rancher's saddled bay tied loosely at the rail, with an apology already half shouted over his shoulder to its startled owner. He put the horse straight into the fleeing man's path along the narrow lane between the stock pens, cutting him off from the open street, and when the thief tried to bolt sideways between two wagons, Abraham's rope, which Maggie had not even seen him unhook from the borrowed saddle, sailed out in a smooth, practiced loop and dropped clean over the man's shoulders, jerking him off his feet into the dust with the satchel flying loose from his grip. Maggie did not wait to see the rest. She had already spotted in the chaos a second figure breaking from the crowd toward the loading pens where the last steers were being driven up the ramp into the stock car, a tall man with a gray-streaked beard and a scar along his jaw that matched, unmistakably, the crude engraving on the old wanted poster she had found in Abraham's drawer. Silas Kane meant to disappear into the very stock car chaos he had chosen as cover, and Maggie Langley, who had spent 3 years building things strong enough to bear more weight than most men ever tested, was not about to let a length of green pine ramp defeat her. She reached the loading chute just as Kane put his boot on it, and with the flat, practical instinct of a carpenter who had spent a lifetime learning exactly where wood gave way, she threw her whole weight against the loose support post at the base of the ramp, a post she had noticed, in passing, was set into dry, sandy ground rather than driven true, and felt it shear sideways exactly as she had hoped. The ramp dropped a full foot at one end, pitching Kane off balance directly into the startled press of cattle being driven up behind him, and for one absurd, terrifying moment, the notorious Silas Kane found himself flat on his back in a stock pen with several 100 pounds of irritated longhorn stepping entirely too close to his outstretched legs. Maggie did not wait to admire her own handiwork. She snatched up a discarded ox goad from beside the chute and stood over the fallen man with it raised like a weapon, shouting for help, until 2 startled drovers and, moments later, Abraham himself, breathless and triumphant with the recovered satchel under his arm and his stolen bay's reins in hand, arrived to haul Kane bodily out of the pen and into the dust of the platform proper. "Silas Kane," Abraham said, standing over the man with an expression Maggie had not seen on him before, something old and weary and finally unafraid. "You are under arrest for robbery, arson, and the attempted murder of Jesse Odell. And you may as well know, whatever you meant to tell this territory about Abraham Cantu, I intend to tell them first and tell them myself." Kane, dust-covered and furious, spat blood from a split lip and glared up at him. "You think that changes anything, Chandler? You think a badge scrubs clean what you did?" "No," Abraham said evenly. "But it is mine to carry honestly from here on instead of yours to hold over my head. That is the difference, Kane. I am done being afraid of my own past." You, on the other hand, are about to spend a good long while explaining yours to a territorial judge." The satchel, when they opened it back at the Marshal's makeshift office in the Benson Depot house, held everything they needed. Odell's signed and witnessed statement naming Kane as the man who shot him and coached him to blame a Langley, and beneath it, damning in its plain ledgerkeeper's handwriting, a record of 3 payments made to SK over the preceding month, each one initialed unmistakably by Cornelius Pratt. It took the territorial court in Tucson less than 2 weeks to sort through the rest, once the evidence was laid before Judge Whitfield in proper form. Silas Kane, facing charges that would keep him behind bars for the better part of 2 decades, proved considerably less loyal to Cornelius Pratt than Pratt had ever been to him, and gave a full accounting of the scheme in exchange for a lighter sentence. Pratt had approached him weeks earlier, having learned through his own inquiries of Kane's old association with Marshal Chandler, and paid him to disrupt the bridge project by any means that would not trace directly back to Pratt's own ledger, up to and including robbing the silver shipment to make the whole town doubt the safety of the route Maggie's bridge was meant to serve. Framing a Langley, any Langley, had been Kane's own touch, a way of buying time and confusion should anything go wrong, and it had very nearly worked exactly as intended. Cornelius Pratt was stripped of his council seat and his ferry charter within the month, the territorial authorities taking a dim view of a councilman caught financing robbery and arson to protect a private monopoly, and though he escaped criminal charges himself through a combination of expensive lawyers and a conveniently thin paper trail, he left Pedra Crossing before the summer's end a ruined and friendless man, and no one, least of all Maggie, shed any tears at his going. Daniel Langley walked out of the Pedra Crossing jail a free man on a bright morning in early July, blinking in the sunlight like a man waking from a long, unpleasant dream, and the first thing he did, to Maggie's very great embarrassment, was to catch her up in a hug tight enough to lift her clean off her feet in front of half the town. "I never doubted you'd get me out," he said into her hair, "on account of you have never in your whole life let anything beat you that you decided to fight." "I had help," Maggie said, setting him back down and glancing, despite herself, toward the boardwalk where Abraham Chandler stood a little apart from the crowd, hat in hand, watching the reunion with an expression of quiet, careful hope. "That help wears a badge and looks at you like you hung the moon," Daniel observed, following her glance with a grin that made him look, for a moment, exactly as young as he actually was. "I noticed. You have been in jail for 2 weeks, Daniel. You have noticed nothing." "I have noticed plenty. A man gets a great deal of thinking time behind bars, and most of my thinking involved wondering how long my sister intended to keep scowling at her own happiness before she let herself have it." Maggie did not dignify that with an answer, though she found, walking toward Abraham across the dusty street with her brother's teasing still ringing in her ears, that her heart was beating rather faster than the short distance warranted. "You are free of him now," Abraham said when she reached him. "Kane, Pratt, all of it. Your brother's name is clear. The council has confirmed your contract stands, and the bridge is yours to finish exactly as you please." "And you?" Maggie asked. "Are you free of it?" He was quiet a moment, turning his hat slowly in his hands. "Judge Whitfield knows the whole truth about Abraham Chandler now. I told him myself before the court proceedings because I did not want it coming out sideways through some newspaper account of Kane's trial. He has decided, given 12 years of honest service and the part I played in bringing Kane and Pratt to justice, that the matter does not warrant charges. But he did suggest, not unkindly, that a marshal with a past like mine might do well to consider whether Pedra Crossing was the place he wished to spend the rest of his career, given how quickly old ghosts seem to find their way here." "And what do you think?" Maggie asked, watching him carefully. "I think," Abraham said, "that I have spent 12 years wearing this badge partly out of genuine conviction and partly out of a need to prove something to men who will never actually forgive me for what I was at 17, no matter how many outlaws I bring in. I think perhaps it is time I did something for reasons that belong entirely to me, and not to anyone's forgiveness." He looked at her then, direct and unguarded in a way that made her breath catch. "I think, Maggie Langley, that I would rather build a life somewhere new, doing work I choose freely, than keep standing guard over a past that no longer defines me. And I find, rather to my own surprise, that I do not want to build that life alone." Maggie's heart was thundering now, plainly enough that she suspected he could probably hear it in the quiet street between them. "That is a very roundabout way of saying something, Marshal Chandler." "Abraham," he corrected softly, "and perhaps it is. I have never before tried to tell a woman that I love her while standing in the middle of a street with half the town still watching us from the jailhouse steps, so you will forgive me if I make a poor job of the delivery." "You love me," Maggie repeated, testing the words as if she wanted to be certain she had built them correctly before trusting her weight to them. "I have loved you, I think, since the first morning I watched you hold a dying stranger together with your bare hands and your own petticoat and refused to so much as flinch," Abraham said. "I have loved you through every argument you have won against me, every joint you have cut truer than I believed possible, every moment you looked at my worst secret and chose, in the end, to stand beside me rather than walk away from me. I do not know how a man says that plainly enough to be believed, except to simply say it. I love you, Maggie Langley, and I would like, very much, to spend whatever years are given to me finding out what it means to build a life beside a woman who never once needed rescuing, only wanted, on occasion, someone worth standing beside." Maggie did not trust her voice for a long moment, standing there in the dusty street with the whole of Pedra crossing pretending very badly not to watch them, and when she finally spoke, it came out rougher than she intended, thick with feeling she had not planned to show so openly. "I love you too, Abraham Chandler or Cantu, or whatever name you choose to carry from here forward, because I have found, somewhat to my own irritation, that I do not much care what name is on the wanted poster. I care what a man does with the years after it." She reached up and settled his crooked hat properly on his head, an oddly domestic gesture that made something in his face crack open into a smile she felt all the way to her toes. "Now kiss me properly, Marshal, before my brother comes over here and ruins the moment with something insufferable." He did not need telling twice. The bridge across the Pedra Gorge was finished by the last week of August, 3 weeks ahead of the schedule Maggie had promised the council. A clean, true span of pine and iron that carried its first loaded freight wagon across the canyon, to the sound of the whole town cheering from both rims at once. Maggie stood at the center of it that afternoon with sawdust in her hair and pride sitting warm in her chest, watching the wagon's wheels roll over joints she had cut with her own hands, and felt, for the first time in 3 hard years, entirely certain of her place in the world. Abraham stood beside her, no longer wearing a badge, having resigned his post the week before in a letter to Judge Whitfield that thanked the territory for the chance to serve, but explained, plainly and without shame, that a man ought to choose his work from hope rather than obligation, and he had chosen instead to accept an offer that had arrived by post only days earlier from a rancher in the Salt River Valley, who needed a horse trainer and foreman with an unmatched eye for good stock and better judgment. Work that called on the vaquero skills his mother's people had given him, rather than the badge his fear had once demanded of him. That evening, after the crowds had drifted home and the last lanterns along the canyon rim had guttered low, Maggie and Abraham sat together at the center of her bridge, feet dangling over the gorge, the stars coming out thick and close the way they only did in that clean desert air. And it was there, with the whole finished span solid and true beneath them, that they finally let themselves be entirely alone together for the first time since everything had begun. "I never thought," Maggie said softly, leaning her head against his shoulder, "that finding a dying stranger in the dust would lead to this, to any of this." My mother would say the Almighty has a fondness for beginning important things in the ugliest possible fashion, Abraham said, wrapping his arm around her, so as to make certain we appreciate the beauty when it finally arrives. Your mother sounds wise, and also entirely too comfortable making pronouncements about my life before she has met me. She will meet you soon enough. I mean to bring you to the rancho before we go north to the Salt River Valley, if you are willing. She will want to see for herself the woman who built a bridge strong enough to hold a whole territory's silver, and still had room left in her to hold a foolish Marshal's heart besides. Maggie laughed, low and warm, and tilted her face up to his in the starlight. I am willing, she said. I find I am willing to go wherever you are going, Abraham Chandler, so long as you understand I intend to keep my tools with me. I do not plan to stop building things simply because I have found a man worth building a life beside. I would never ask you to stop, he said, and kissed her there on the bridge she had built with her own 2 hands, slow and certain, with the canyon wind moving soft around them and the stars wheeling steady overhead. And Maggie Langley, who had spent 3 years proving herself to a territory that doubted her at every turn, finally let herself believe that she had found, in this quiet, steady, once-lost man, not a rescue she had never needed, but a partner worth the whole, long fight it had taken to reach him. They were married in October, in a small ceremony at the Ibarra Rancho south of the border, with Abraham's mother Dolores presiding over the preparations with a fierce, delighted energy that left Maggie feeling, for the first time since her own mother's death years before, entirely folded into a family again. And Daniel stood as witness on Maggie's side, grinning through the whole ceremony in a way that suggested he had, indeed, noticed everything he claimed to have noticed weeks earlier in that jail cell. They did not linger long afterward to build a house or settle into any single fixed corner of the territory. Within a month they had packed what they needed onto a wagon Maggie herself had reinforced for the long haul, her tools carefully wrapped and stowed alongside Abraham's saddle and rope, and set out together for the Salt River Valley and the new work waiting there. 2 capable, once lonely people who had found in each other not an ending to build toward, but a beginning worth riding into side by side, with the whole wide, unfinished territory stretching out ahead of them under a bright and endless summer sky. Behind them, the bridge across the Pedra Gorge stood solid in the morning light, carrying wagons and cattle and travelers steadily across the canyon that had once demanded a ferryman's toll and a town's dependence. A plain, sturdy, honest structure that would stand, Maggie knew with the quiet certainty of a craftsman who trusted her own work. For a great many years after the 2 people who had fought so hard to see it finished had ridden on to build whatever came next.